and welcome to another Java tutorial. If you recall, in the last time I said we were going to be working on saving a timestamp with each one of these expressions into the database. That way we could go back for auditing purposes and see when the expression had actually been run against our endpoint. And so for a few of you scratching your heads as to why you might want to do that, say you built this as a real application, and this endpoint supports pretty minimal stuff. So the calculator class, it only supports 4 operations, and it only supports all of those operations with 2 operands. So it's really very limited, but your startup, you want to get out there quick, so you're all about those minimum viable products. So you want to put together your app, push it out into the wild, and start letting your beta customers or whatever hammer on it and see what happens. So say you get this call from your customer. You've released your API, they've been using it, and they ran into some errors. But they don't call you right away. They call you like a week after it happens. So you can't just look right through the server logs, at least not that easily. And if you recall, we're actually not logging the request output anymore. We're just saving it into the database. And they tell you, okay, so I did this request and I got an error 500, or a response code 500, internal server error, which means that they broke the API. And we want to see what code, what expression that they ran against this API endpoint. But they remember when they did it. So what we want to do is we want to create a little trail for ourselves so that if we know when something happened, we could go back and hopefully find the culprit. And so let's start. There are other ways of doing this, but I'm going to start simple. I'm just going to use long to represent the date, so I'm going to use the system.currentTimeMillis. So I'm going to call it timestamp. And then I'm going to create a getter and setter. And then there are a few places that we could put this. Now, separation of concern says that we probably want to have this in the DAO, because this DAO is responsible for actually persisting things into the database. So we might want to add another line of code here. We might want to create our expression and then do expression.setTimestamp or something like that. But that could also get messy because maybe another programmer comes along later and they're changing this code, or they're changing the code inside of the calculator class, and they don't use the same method in the DAO to actually call it. And since we don't actually own the code that exists in this entity manager.persist, we actually don't know what this implementation will look like. We cannot effectively say that every time this class is persisted that the timestamp will be set correctly. And putting it here in the empty constructor is also bad, because let's say I do this.timestamp system.currentTimeMillis. I do something like this. Well, this actually already doesn't work because we don't use the empty constructor when we create an expression with a string, because our code doesn't have a call to this in it. And this also can break because if somebody else creates a constructor, they could also forget to call this. And to make matters even worse, if we use the same code with expressions that are already in the database that didn't have a timestamp. So let's say we upgrade our application to add this timestamp, and we still have those old entities that didn't have a timestamp saved with them. With this line of code right here in the empty constructor, that means that when our DAO pulls those out of the database and runs the empty constructor to create an instance of the class, all of those are going to falsely have a timestamp of the current time that a request was run against our get endpoint. So these are just many reasons that this is really bad code. And fortunately, the Java Persistence API has a really slick solution to this, which is that we can receive a callback. So I'm actually going to make this method private because I don't want outside code to see this as something they can call. I don't want programmers to say, oh, let me just set the timestamp. We want to leave this sort of to be opaque. So this is just going to have one line of code, which is going to call our setter with system.currentTime_millis, and that's all it's going to do. And then we're going to add an annotation at pre-persist. And all this is doing, it's creating a method that actually the outside code can't see, but through the way that JPA works, when you call persist on this class, it's actually going to find this, and it's going to run this, even though it's a private method. I'm not going to talk about how that's done right now, but just know that this is a really nice way to solve these types of problems. So let's run this so you can see the result. The server is running, so let's run a couple of requests against it. And don't forget, I'm using data, which is a flag to curl to say that this is what I want to post. And then localhost 8080 calculator. And don't forget, just as a quick memory jogger, it's our JakartaEE configuration is set to an application path of root, and our calculator API class is set to a path of calculator. So we just append calculator to whatever's set to our application path. So that's how we get this URL. So I'm going to run this, and then I'm going to run another one. Okay, so we've run a couple of requests against it, and now I'm going to do a get. So in order to do a get, all I have to do is get rid of that data flag, and I'm going to add a new line after it. So there we go. So even though we had a private method, it actually called it every time that the class was saved into the database. And what's great about this is that we didn't have to modify any code outside of the expression class. So there are a few schools of thought on whether or not this kind of concern should be placed on the model, but for many reasons, this is just the right place to have this code, and this is a really handy callback. And there are other callbacks that we're maybe going to get into in the future, but please subscribe and come back next time, because we're actually going to blow this whole project away and we're going to start all over. We're going to build a new application. Catch you next time.